Welcome back to the NDP Pierrefonds-Dollard Leadership Panel Debate. And let's move on to our second segment called the economy. Here's the first question. Canada had a federal minimum wage until 1996, when it was abolished in favor of applying the provincial minimum wage to federally regulated industries and giving provinces these powers alone, as per Section 92 of our Canadian Constitution Act. The federal government in the past years set its own minimum wage rates for workers who work in federal jurisdictions, such as railway. How would a $15 minimum wage apply? And how do we solve the minimum wage question? And that first question goes to Jamie.
Well, I'd say the $15 minimum wage, this is the basic start that we have to do. Right now, as we speak, the federal government has 40,000 precarious employees. These are people that are working on contract. They don't get the full benefits that usual federal workers would get. And so Charlie Angus is looking at those workers as the place to start in terms of wage fairness. And he wants to solve that right away, because you start in your own backyard and you take care of those federal workers that are in a precarious situation.
Thank you, Jamie. Patrick?
I'm going to agree with that. Guy supports the $15 minimum wage for federal employees. Obviously, the provinces control more of the minimum wages in a different sector, so you can only control what you can control. Like with his $15 minimum wage, it would help afford these people to get out of the precarious work, and also he would also be tying it to inflation, and that's an important point to remember, because let's just say we get the $15 minimum wage. What happens then? The Conservatives can be like, oh, well, everybody's okay now. We don't need to raise it anymore, and that's a big issue. You need to be tying it to inflation as well.
Thank you. Anthony?
Jagmeet as well is in favor of raising the minimum wage in federally regulated industries to $15 an hour. I think this is the least that you could ask of the government to ensure that its workers, if they work full-time, don't live in poverty. But I would also add that in addition to the $15 minimum wage, it's also important to make sure that that $15, because depending on where you live in Canada, the costs of living get higher, to also have wage subsidies for those workers who live in areas that need it. And so Jagmeet has proposed his wage subsidy program in his fairer income agenda, and I think that is the way to go.
Okay, now let's move to our 3-minute open debate, starting with Patrick. Do you agree with what your fellow panelists have said so far?
I think the basis of modern New Democrats these days is $15 an hour, or bust. It's $15 an hour. But I would also, I just think that we're in violent agreement here. I really like the fact that there's the wage subsidies, because that is a reality. We can't forget that, like in BC, for example, they have a high cost of living, and it's different from another province, let's just say Saskatchewan, where it might be a bit lower. So I'm in agreement. So.
But I think, one thing that the other two candidates are missing here is the fact that, yes, you can have a $15 minimum wage. That's a great start. But there's 40,000 precarious employees. These are people that don't have permanent status. So you could pay temporary workers $15 an hour, and then their temp agency will take a cut of that, and they won't actually be paid $15 an hour. Charlie Angus is the only one that's talking about taking those 40,000, making them permanent, expanding their benefits, instead of paying temp agencies. Right now we're spending millions of dollars for these temp agencies to employ these 40,000 temporary workers. Let's bring them in-house. Let's take care of them. Let's expand their benefits so that we're not creating two classes of workers in the federal government. We're creating a strong public service. And the other thing about this is that it predominantly affects women in the federal service. And so we have to scrap this idea that started, I believe, in the early 1990s, get rid of this idea that we have temporary workers and actually bring them on and get that continuity and intelligence in the public service through these permanent workers who are really proud and dedicated to serving Canada.
Good. Interesting. All right. Interestingly, you answered my follow-up question.
Could I just add something?
Go ahead.
I agree with the spirit of what you said. However, I have to point out that Jagmeet actually does have a policy in his Fair Work agenda that does address those workers who work for temp agencies. Jagmeet Singh has advocated expanding their benefits, expanding their wages, and expanding the minimum requirements for working conditions so that those temporary workers are indeed treated like full-time workers. And so I'm in agreement with Charlie's policy, and so is Jagmeet Singh.
I would also tend to people are tending to forget the interns in constituency offices. They aren't even paid. They're not paid whatsoever. And why is that happening? New Democrats, we should be advocating for fair wages for these people, for these interns that are in the constituency offices, and that's not being talked about either.
Here's a question that I have. Where do we get the $15 from? Why can't we go higher than $15? Would anyone like to answer that question?
Well, I think, in speaking to Charlie's campaign is that they said, at this point in time, 15 might be a bit low. I mean, 15 is almost the fight of 5 years ago. And with the inflation, the rise in cost of living, that we might need to relook at what the real minimum wage should be.
All right. Let's move to our second question regarding the economy. And here it is. It depends whether or not we have a lot of graduates in our audience. In the 2017 list by QS, none of our Canadian universities are amongst the top 10 institutions with the highest graduate employability. And notice I said graduate. The closest is the University of Toronto, which is at 19th position. How should graduate employability be risen in Canada? And let's begin with Anthony.
Well, I think that what I'm most concerned about in this question is before we even address graduate employability, do people have access to education in Canada? And that's, I think, the most important question and where we should start. The National Post recently reported that the average student debt of people leaving university is $25,000, which is quite high. And so I think that Jagmeet Singh advocacy for scrapping tuition fees in higher education is a good place to start. And of course, investment in research, but we'll have time to talk about that.
Actually, regarding education, Canada has one of the highest rates in terms of post-secondary education. In fact, it's around 59%, I believe, according to statistics released this year. But student debt is a concern, and I'm sure everyone can agree to that, despite the fact that Canada has one of the highest middle class medians in terms of incomes. Would you agree that the debt is the main issue that's preventing access to education, or would you say that we have access to education but not enough jobs? Patrick?
I would say that it is due to the rising level of precarious work, to the rising level of automation. I would say that. Guy Caron's put forward a workers' first agenda, and this agenda tackles the main issue of automation. He's also talked about climate justice with that too. It's not just student debt, it's really just the quality of jobs, like the quality, the amount of money you're making of the job too. That's the main issue, I would think.
Jamie?
Well, I would say that the jobs aren't there. We're facing this new working class that is very precarious. I'd agree with Patrick about that. But the job creators in Canada, the majority of job creators are small businesses. And Charlie's come up with this plan for simplifying, becoming a cooperative and organizing businesses as a cooperative. We've seen through studies that co-ops have better success rates, they give back to the community, they have higher wages, and they're community builders. I witnessed that at the Official Languages Committee when we looked at co-ops in Francophone communities outside of Quebec, that when they had companies that were organized as co-ops, they were much more resilient in their communities. So Charlie's plan is quite ambitious to get these good jobs going by supporting small businesses through the co-op movement.
For those who do not know what co-ops are, they're the types of enterprises that are managed solely by their members collectively, in comparison to corporations or other forms of enterprises.
Could I comment on the
Sure,
education?
yes.
Okay.
I just wanted to, because before it was suggested that access to education in Canada is actually quite good. And what I would say is that education in Canada is accessible if we compare ourselves to the United States. But I would say that access to education in Canada is unequal. So what do I mean by unequal? I come from an upper middle class family. I'm applying to law school in the fall. I now have a part-time job. If I discovered that I had too much work at school and so I needed to quit my part-time job, I have the privilege of doing that. Okay. Some students don't. That means that because of that systemic issue, which is high tuition fees, I am actually put in a position where I have a greater chance at success. And so that's why I think that scrapping tuition fees are important. It's not because I don't think that, for example, Quebec has done a good job of giving a lot of people access to education. I just think we can do better.
Okay.
But what is but I want to ask you, but how are you going to do that? Because if you're negotiating the provinces, that's with tuition fees, how are you going to be, that could take years to do. You have a rebellious premier in Manitoba who's fighting the tax reforms right now. With the basic income, you could be tackling that all at once. You can be, you could be helping students pay their tuitions. 2, you could be helping them with the money situation, with food, rent, expenses, whatever. With the basic income, it's better, I would think, than just negotiating with the provinces for a free tuition. It won't work. It's hard enough with that.
I think too that we have to take care of people that have been hurt by the system that's in place right now, the people that are working 2-3 jobs and carrying a big student debt after their education. Education should be to enrich our society, it shouldn't be necessarily a straight shot to producing workers in certain industry. It's actually to enrich our society. And the people that have actually made the dedication to doing those studies shouldn't be burdened for 20, 30 years with a high student loan debt. And I think the Angus campaign's been talking a lot about increasing amnesty to debt holders so that they can move and be full contributors to the economy.
You know what? Why don't we have an actual plan for people who have graduated with their masters, with PhD, and have federal jobs? You know, you can't find a sponsor to do more research. Why don't you come work for the government and we'll provide your research funds for you? Wouldn't that be great? No? There's another rhetorical question. Moving on to our next question regarding the Trudeau budget. Justin Trudeau's government is projected to leave a $5.7 billion deficit over 6 years. Our debt to GDP ratio is at the moment 31.5%. Ian Lee, who's an associate professor from Carleton University in Business, says, and I quote, "Right now, there is no crisis, but continued deficits will definitely reduce our flexibility and our degrees of freedom. Is our debt to GDP ratio in good standing, and what should be done about it?" And with that question, we'll start with Patrick.
Well, to counter this issue is you should be stimulating the economy, as there is a huge debt to GDP ratio. You should be getting the people who are unemployed, you should be getting them out to work. And with the Workers' First agenda, you'd be doing that. With the climate justice, we would be able to get our goods and services faster with a high-speed train system from Toronto to Montreal, from Calgary to Edmonton. These are things that we're forgetting because they go we use these to get our goods and services from place to place, but we need cheaper and faster transportation as well.
Okay, Anthony?
I would say that deficit spending is something that's widely recognized as a legitimate tool of government by economists. What I would say, however, is that the way that the Liberals are incurring this deficit is, by example, spending $30 billion on an infrastructure privatization bank, which is a complete waste of money and doesn't go back to the consumer. They're refusing to crack down on tax loopholes. That would also reduce the deficit. So they're spending money on new fighter jets. When was the last time that Canada had to defend the homeland with fighter jets? These are things that we have to think about, and I would say that deficit spending that goes directly back into the economy is a legitimate tool of government, but we have to be spending it on the right things.
Okay. Jamie.
I think that economists all agree that you go into deficits to stimulate an economy during rough times. But there's another time that you can use deficit spending. That's when you want to target industries that make us competitive in the world, that make us innovative. Unfortunately, the Liberals at present, as Anthony pointed out, through their investments in private infrastructure bank, the deficit spending isn't being targeted in a way that's going to improve our competitiveness. It's not going to advance innovation in our country. And we really have to start looking at, how we're spending our money, how we're spending taxpayer dollars to promote the advancement of this country and to help working people that are hurting right now and are struggling to meet paycheck to paycheck.
All right. So two things the three of you mentioned that were quite interesting and I want to follow up on. Number one thing was about the notion of green and transport-oriented jobs. And speaking of transport, I think of our aerospace industry, particularly here in Quebec. The Trudeau government earlier this year actually, backtracking a little bit before this, the Quebec government always bailed out aeronautic companies, and as a result of these repetitive instances, the Trudeau government stepped in and finally allocated $37.5 million to Bombardier alone and had some terms and conditions should enough jobs be created and investments in R&D and so on. But with a 31.5% debt to GDP ratio, do you think that is substantial? All of these issues combined. Patrick.
Well, what they did with the $37.5 million is they gave it to their CEOs, or intended to, and they didn't spend it on their workers, on helping their company grow, on helping their company whatsoever. They just spent it on their top 1%, and that's something that Guy would be getting rid of. He would be putting an end to the tax loophole with the stock options that CEOs get, and that's one thing that he'd be doing. As I understand, he would also be willing to do a jobs pledge, something that I don't think the Trudeau government really got around to, and as a result, they just pocketed it, like the CEOs, the board of directors, they just pocketed it into their wallets. So.
Yeah. Jamie.
Well, I think Charlie's been pretty clear in saying that if you get Canadian taxpayer dollars for your company or industry, there's going to be strict conditions on there. If you get the subsidy, you're not just going to take it and move ship and hire workers in Mexico or wherever in the world and enrich your CEOs. He's actually going to put the conditions there where if you're getting this money, it's going to have to be for Canadian workers, for businesses operating in Canada.
Anthony.
I would agree with my colleagues in terms of subsidizing industry, but I also think that the issue of deficit spending itself is a holistic issue. So, for example, if you put in place the policies that we all favor and give people $15 minimum wage, Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois pointed this out at the National Assembly the other day. This is economics 101. You give someone $15, they'll go spend it. They'll put it back into the economy. Mm-hmm. Businesses will make more money, and the government gets that money back without spending a cent. Spending money on building retrofit programs, on transportation, on electric chargers for electric cars. These are all things that Jagmeet has advocated for, and these are all things that will not only help the economy grow, but will help people be better off at the end. And that goes back to what we talked about earlier. This is what progressivism is about.
Speaking of tax loopholes, isn't it frustrating that we still have not thought of a solution? Whether we've had conservative or liberal governments, we still have this issue that keeps coming up. Which brings me to taxes. First question is about income sprinkling. So, this is a recent issue, and here's the question. Mr. Morneau, who's our finance minister, announced in the budget back in March that Liberals have not been pleased with some Canadians who are using corporations in their tax planning, and that changes would have to be made. The claim was that certain folks are using corporations to pay less than their fair share of taxes. While the proposed changes are meant to affect the wealthy, there is also no shortage of small business owners, which will significantly mean that it's worse off as a result. Some business owners sprinkle income to their family members by way of salary or wages or even dividends to reduce their family's overall tax burden. What should be done about income sprinkling? And with that, we'll start with Jamie.
Well, I would say that yes, this is an issue of the day, but we have to look at the Liberals' approach to taxation globally and the fact that they really didn't go after the problem of offshoring, the fact that they really didn't continue the investigation into KPMG and their practices at committee. The Liberals actually shut that down. We're talking about a very big fish here, a lot of money. Instead, the Liberals have chosen, probably for media advantage, to go after small business owners, people that are basically struggling to keep their businesses going. Yes, there may be a problem, but it's kind of like killing a fly with a sledgehammer, what they're doing right now.
Okay, Patrick?
That's the thing. These are affecting especially the farmers. There's quite a few farmers who use corporations because they're already not making enough to get by, and that's just something that's very unfortunate with the Liberal government. With Guy Caron, if he were Prime Minister, he would be putting out a office for tax evasion. He would be attacking the CEOs who aren't paying their fair share. He would be attacking the 1% who aren't paying their fair share. That was what he would be doing. He'd be getting those tax loopholes out of the way.
Okay, Anthony?
I'd once again agree with my colleagues. I think that should we be thinking about cracking down on income sprinkling? Absolutely. Do we have bigger fish to fry first? Yes, and the estimates and the studies are clear. There are literally tens of billions of dollars of taxable income that are stored overseas by Canadian billionaires. And going back to even our previous conversation about deficit spending, this is one of the areas that we should focus on. And I think it's pretty obvious why the Liberal government is not focusing on this. I don't know the numbers, but I would guarantee that Justin Trudeau probably spends as much time talking to lobbyists and CEOs as he does taking selfies, which is a lot. So
I couldn't agree more. Actually, isn't this very similar to the conservative idea of income splitting? Remember when Harper was running for, once again, re-election in 2015? He was talking about that?
Yeah.
Isn't it very similar?
I think there's a little bit of a difference. I mean,
Do tell.
There is a problem in terms of these loopholes that exist. Justin Trudeau benefited from them, by the way, through his incorporation for his speaking business. But the difference, I think, is that if you look at small businesses, they're mostly mom-and-pop family operations where everyone, whether they're actually working in the business or not, they're a part of it. They're taking the risk as a family to go into this business. And so for someone like Justin Trudeau, who benefited from that loophole, probably just for his own enrichment, to point fingers at small families that are trying to run their businesses and saying, oh, they're unfairly sprinkling this income amongst themselves, that whole family's taking a risk that he never had because he had, a trust fund that was waiting for him. He had the entitlements of being the Prime Minister's son and inheriting money. So to see the Liberals use this sense of entitlement to go after our main business creator, or job creators in this country, it really, I can see the anger in the neighborhoods where I live, in the small business owners. And I think, someone like Charlie understands that we have to almost redo the entire tax code. It's much too complex. It's been tinkered with for decades by Liberal and Conservative governments, boutique tax credits here, there, friends, lobbyists, special interest groups. So it has to be redone so that it's actually fair. So a lot of economists have said that Canada's tax code is too complex, it's too hard to understand. Charlie's been talking about, let's redo it from ground zero. It's not going to be done right away, but it's something that he's definitely looking at doing, simplifying so that it's fair for all Canadians.
Okay. Let's come to our next question, which ironically is about small and medium business enterprises. So this next question is from Mardik Badanian, who's an executive on the Pierrefonds-Dollard NDP. A majority of Canadians work for companies that employ between 10 to 500 employees. Just looking at it statistically, the percentage of small enterprises in Canada comprise of 97.9%, which employ up to 99 people. Tom Mulcair advocated reducing taxes on these enterprises. So what are the candidates' positions regarding taxes on small or medium businesses? And what should be done to resolve these? We'll start with Anthony.
Well, Jagmeet has talked about raising the federal corporate tax rate from 15% to 19%. And of course, the 15% tax rate only applies to large businesses. So Jagmeet really is targeting his tax plan changes to those large businesses that can afford to pay more. And that is, of course, in recognition of the fact, as you mentioned, Eddie, and as Jamie mentioned before, small businesses are the job creators in Canada, and we should be supporting them.
Okay. Jamie.
Well, like I said before, we can talk about, and we have in past election campaigns, of moving this percentage point this way, up, down. But really, we do have to look at the tax code in general and ensure that it's fair for all. I don't think that the small fixes, the boutique tax credits, the small movements in percentage points are actually going to get us to the place that we need to be. We actually have to reformulate the tax code so that it is fair for small and medium businesses. And also the way that we organize our businesses. I mean, I know as a small business owner that it was easier for me to incorporate as a nonprofit business than it was as a cooperative federally. And as I said before, there's lots of advantages to organizing as a cooperative business. So Charlie's intending to simplify that. He wants to simplify the tax code so that it's fair for all Canadians, in recognition that those enterprises, the 10 to 500 employee enterprises, are the ones that are holding our economy up.
Okay. Patrick.
Guy also supports a raising the corporate tax rate from 15 to 19%. Corporations, especially the larger ones, aren't paying their fair share. For example, Apple is incorporated in Ireland. Their headquarters is in Ireland, and they just get around everything by paying by being everywhere, so that they pay very little. And with Guy Caron, he would be with his tax loopholes, like with his office to get rid of the tax loopholes, that would be beneficial to the small business owners, to Canadians, and that's what matters.
Okay. Interestingly, for those who love statistics, I have a few for you. Did you all know that 70.5% of our labor force are employed by small enterprises? So with regards to tax rates now, the Liberals have done something very different from Conservatives. So here's how it works, just for those just tuning in about taxes. So the basic tax rate for corporations is at 38%, and it is taxable income. And then there is something they call a federal tax abatement of 28%. So in the end, there's a general tax reduction, and the next net tax rate is apparently 15%. I thought it would be 10, but whatever. So is this an actual good method? you find of actually encouraging economic growth domestically?
Do you mind just repeating the details of the last part of the question?
Sure. So basically,
Well, I
there's
think the fact that
Yeah.
he has to repeat the details of the question touches on exactly what Charlie's saying, that we have to redo the tax code so that it's understandable to most Canadians. Because it is, you know, you listen to, oh, wait a second, it's 38, but then they move it down, and then this percentage point. And so for your average small, medium business owner, they don't have the time or the team of lawyers to study like these policies, these tax policies to get advantage, you know, find an advantage. So I think where the growth is happening with these is with the larger corporations that have the team of lawyers that can look at the tax policy, that have the team of accountants and go like, okay, we can get this advantage here, this loophole here, whereas the average citizen doesn't benefit. So that's why Charlie's saying we have to look at the tax code and start from ground zero again and build up, rather than continue these liberal and conservative policies that no one understands, that need a team of lawyers for explanation, that need a team of accountants to actually to make them understandable.
The next segment is LGBT rights. C'est la commission LGBT du Section Québec qui ont 2 questions pour nous. Première question. Que pensez-vous de la chirurgie des enfants intersexes sans leur consentement? Et on va commencer cette question avec Patrick.
I40, il soutient les politiques du NPD, donc oui, c'est ça.
OK. Jamie?
Ben, je pense que le bilan de Charlie est clair. Dans le passé, quand ça a venu l'enjeu de le mariage homosexuel, Charlie a été fort, une forte voix. Même son propre Église l'a jeté dehors à cause de sa position. Alors, il y a le courage de promouvoir les enjeux de la communauté LGBT. Et je pense que concernant la chirurgie, il sera clairement contre la chirurgie sans consentement de la personne.
OK. Puis Anthony?
Moi, je crois que c'est clair que nous devrons tous être contre des chirurgies qui sont administrées sans le consentement de l'enfant. Jagmeet a déjà mis de l'avant son plan de consulter avec la communauté LGBT pour mettre de l'avant un plan pour mieux comprendre les enjeux de santé de cette communauté. C'est une autre chose que j'aime de Jagmeet, il est humble. Il ne sait pas tout, il veut consulter avec les militants qui sont sur le terrain.
OK. On a un consensus. Alors, prochaine question. Êtes-vous en faveur de la criminalisation de la VIH? Anthony.
Eh bien, la transmission, mais non, il ne devrait pas être criminalisé. Ce qu'on a besoin, et puis ça c'est plus au niveau des provinces, c'est d'avoir un système d'éducation sexuelle qui apprend aux jeunes comment bien se protéger. Et je crois que ce n'est pas sous la juridiction fédérale, mais quand même, c'est ma position.
C'est ma position aussi, comme je suis contre la criminalisation du VIH, c'est quelque chose qui attaque les minorités. Et donc, pour le NPD, on est le parti des minorités, donc je suis contre.
Et je pense que quand on voit l'historique du parti, Jack Layton a fait beaucoup de travail dans cette communauté. Il savait durant les années 80 que c'était une population stigmatisée. Puis on était toujours les brageurs à leur défendre les droits des personnes qui ont ce maladie. Alors, je ne sais pas la position de Charlie, mais je crois probablement qu'il est contre la criminalisation.
Je pense que comme un parti, on est tous contre. Speaking of HIV and LGBT issues, currently gay couples are not able to donate blood as hetero couples do, since the medical field recognizes, in quite a discriminatory fashion, that gay men have higher risks of transferring sexually transmitted diseases. How do we remedy this? And let's start that question with Anthony.
Jagmeet Singh's position is simple: repeal the blood ban.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Same thing?
Yeah.
Pretty much the same thing. I mean, it's a flagrant broken promise by Justin Trudeau. He said that he was going to repeal it, and then once in power, he didn't. And I think that this blood ban's gone on for too long. I knew guys that I went to school with in university that they wanted to give blood, and it was obvious that, you know, looking at it, that you know, stigmatizing the gay population, the homosexual population for this alone. I mean, everybody can suffer from these diseases now. It's not one population. This is like old school thinking from the 1980s when Jack Layton was working with people with HIV and AIDS. You know, are we still stuck in 1983? It's got to end.
Would you like to intervene?
As Justin Trudeau once said, because it's 2015, well, because it's 2017, and we should be modernizing the LGBT policies that our government uses, the LGBT policies that the medical field uses, we should be modernizing because it's 2017.
Actually, I was at the Terrebonne convention a while back with Anthony. So an interesting topic that arose was affirmative action used for the LGBT community, especially with our medical issues. Would you say that it is a doable thing, having an affirmative action program in our medical field? Let's start with Jimmy.
Sure. I mean, I'm sure that Charlie would be willing to look into that if it's, you know, I don't know the details of the program or what it's about, but I'm sure that bringing equity to the medical profession would definitely be something to look into. Okay. There's, you know, professional orders that are usually at provincial level, so federal government could have a part to play in terms of education and promotion.
Okay, Patrick.
Well, Guy Caron is a bridge builder. He unites the party with different ideas, different identities, and that's what he's about. And I'm sure he would definitely be willing to listen, since that's what he's always been about.
Okay, Anthony.
Well, Jagmeet has talked about this a little bit. He has said that, once again, as I mentioned before, that he's ready to consult with the LGBT community on a policy that would be put forth, or should I say a recommendation that would be put forth by the federal government to the provinces, specifically to do with trans and intersex people. They have specific, especially surgical and medical needs, and this is an area where, of course, affirmative action is called for. Affirmative action seeks to remedy inequities that are existing. It's not about treating anyone as superior to another, and so this is an area where I think Jagmeet is clear, and I agree with him.
Actually, not to sound too much like a lawyer, affirmative actions are legal when it comes to our Canadian Charter, specifically Section 15.2. When we have a disadvantaged segment of a population, then it is the government's job to implement programs to advance those minorities' rights and needs, actually. All right, that is the end of our second segment of tonight's debate. When we come back, we will talk about trade and foreign policy.